So we talked a little bit about the other day about that fertilizer percentage. So if you have that fertilizer, again, that we talked about, 686, does everyone remember what these numbers mean?
Yeah.
Anyone?
Nitrogen.
Yeah, the first one is nitrogen, second one is phosphorus, and the third one is potassium, but they use the Latin word kalium for potassium. That's called the NPK ratio, right? So 6% nitrogen, 8% potassium, 6%, or 8% phosphorus, 6% potassium. Okay, so say that's a fertilizer that's commonly used, and you'll see that fertilizers, if you looked at organic fertilizers, they generally have really low numbers, right? Really low numbers. If you get Miracle-Gro is like 20, which is not an organic fertilizer, it's a chemical fertilizer. It's like 20, 42, 68 or some huge numbers. So they're huge percentages. They do have to add up to less than 100. But they're huge percentages. And then you look at organic fertilizers and they're kind of like 2, 4, 3. And you go, well, geez, this chemical fertilizer is giving me all this nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And it's actually cheaper than the organic fertilizer that's only giving me, you know, at first glance, hey, you found us.
I found a good one.
Is only giving us like a total of 10% nutrients. And so at first glance, you kind of think, well, it's a better deal to get, you know, the chemical fertilizer that costs less and has all these nutrients in it, rather than this organic fertilizer that has very low NPK ratio, and so it doesn't appear to have much nutrients in it. But it's more than meets the eye. Math isn't everything. Because what these numbers indicate are the readily available nutrients, the soluble nutrients. So the plant, the stuff that when you put it on the plant, it will drink it up right away, whatever it can. What do you think happens to the rest of it if the plant doesn't drink it up?
Does it become insoluble?
It can in some cases. That's not completely out of the question, because it can chemically bond with other things in the soil to become unavailable. But there's other things that can happen. Any other guesses?
Isn't it the case that if you have too high of a percentage for the plant to uptake, it can actually block the absorption of other minerals from the soil?
That's another thing that can happen. Yep, absolutely. So there's a bunch of things, there's a bunch of possibilities here. And so right away we're starting to see that maybe it's not good to have too much of of something. Anything else that can happen that you can think of? Yeah, Kate.
Leaches out, poisons fish.
Leaches out, poisons fish. Poisons the ecosystem. That's another thing that can happen. And the last thing can happen is a certain amount of it can actually stick to the soil. But the soil also has only a certain capacity to hold on to nutrients. So after that capacity is maximized, then the rest of it will absolutely leach out. And if you go to a golf course and you'll see, you go to their fertilizer shed, you'll see bags and bags and bags and bags of fertilizer that they're spreading. And the recommendations to apply chemical fertilizers are purposely high because they know so much is gonna leach out. So really, we're kind of not really being very efficient. Chemical fertilizers are not very efficient at all. What happens with organic fertilizers is that you have smaller percentages, but that's just the readily available stuff. And usually the filler for organic fertilizers is not really filler that's been added in. It's just materials that the fertilizer are made of that don't, that are locking up the nutrients. So say if an organic fertilizer is made of alfalfa, some of the nitrogen in the alfalfa will be immediately available. And so that percentage will be indicated in the NPK ratio. The rest of it needs microbial action to break down. So it's not that there is just, say, 4% nitrogen in an organic fertilizer. There's 4% available nitrogen in the fertilizer, and the remainder must be broken down by microbes. So you see the importance of microbes in an organic system. If you have a non-organic system, if you're growing hydroponically, all your nutrients are soluble, and the plant just takes them up or it doesn't, you know, based on things like pH. And so pH is crucial to control in a hydroponic system. In an organic system, it's not so crucial. So it's like comparing apples and oranges when you compare organic fertilizers with chemical fertilizers. They're totally different. Their whole absorption rate is different. Plants take them up differently through different mechanisms. But which mechanism do you think plants have used since the beginning of time? It's the organic mechanism, right? Where microbes, they have associations with microbes that help them absorb it. So even at a very low NPK, we're looking at 6% nitrogen. And here, the composition of a plant is between 1 and 4% nitrogen. And 4% nitrogen is only present in the seed. Most plants will only have in their tissues about 1% nitrogen. Do they need, say there's some chemical fertilizers that are like 20, 20, 20, whoops, 20. So, why are we applying all that nitrogen? The plant only has 1% nitrogen in it, and some of that 20 might stick to your either your soilless media or your soil, depending on your soil. We'll talk about how different soils hold on to nutrients later. But you really don't need that much nitrogen, generally, for your plants. So don't get mixed up with comparing chemical fertilizers and organic fertilizers, because they're totally different. And what happens in an organic system is the plants need a steady source of nitrogen, because nitrogen, it builds proteins, it's responsible for a lot of energy reactions in the plant, but it needs a little bit at a time, just a little bit at a time to use for those energetic functions. And so what happens in a well-functioning ecosystem is the plant actually gives off chemical signals to feed, and chemical exudates to feed the microbes that will then feed them nitrogen. So it's completely coordinated. So the organic matter in the soil is broken down at a rate that the plant needs it. So it's completely efficient, and there isn't any wasted. So most of what a plant is composed of is carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. Where does the plant get that? Where does the plant get its carbon?
Photosynthesis? Is it photosynthesis?
Photosynthesis uses carbon. What the process of photosynthesis is the process of the plant taking in what materials? Carbon dioxide and water, right? So carbon dioxide is CO2, water is H2O. So here we have carbon, here we have oxygen, here we have hydrogen, here we have more oxygen. So basically, through photosynthesis, plants are making plant tissues basically out of thin air with a teeny bit of nitrogen and a teeny bit of 70 different minerals that are all found commonly in soil. So the plant really, in an organic system, is very dependent on these microbes. And that's why our job is to make sure the microbes stay alive and healthy and happy. That's our biggest job. It's not feeding the plants, it's feeding the microbes. So feeding the soil so that the microbes have something to eat, making sure the soil is the right texture so the plants can breathe, and making sure that the microbes have sufficient water, because without water, what happens to any of us? Any living thing? You get gross. Photosynthesis is that process where our plants take in light through their chloroplasts, and they convert that, again, the CO2 and water into carbs. Carbs are plant food, and they end up becoming people food, right? One way or another, whether they become people food through people eating carbs, or whether they become people food by animals eating carbs and then people eating animals. Carbs are kind of the basis of the food chain. Another way that plants can take up food is uptake from the environment directly. So there is a certain amount of those, we mentioned, soluble nutrients, right? We talked about how some of those nutrients in the nutrients in chemical fertilizers and some of the nutrients in organic fertilizers. Say you have fish fertilizer. Well, that's a liquid anyway, right? And it's high in nitrogen. And so the plant, if you pour some fish fertilizer into the soil, the plant can just take it up along with the water that it takes up from the environment.